Tonight I want to concentrate particularly on a set of principles, if you like, or ways that we can think about technology as we consider whether or not we're going to adopt it, and particularly talking tonight about how that might affect our families and the ecclesia. God willing, next week I want to look a lot more closely at our brains, our minds, and the way that technology interacts with us at a neural level. We'll look at some of the science behind addiction and distraction and what that means to us. And that'll be very much focused on us as individuals, although there's clearly overlap into both ecclesia and family in that as well. But God willing, we'll see some principles, if you like, over the next 2 weeks, which can help us as we approach the way that we look at and adopt technologies that are around us. I don't know whether it's usual here at Golden Grove, but if you want to make comments or ask questions at any stage during the night, please do so. I'm also open to challenge and disagreement if people think that what I've got to say is not something that they agree with, so feel free. Another thing I want to say right up front is I'm not putting myself up here as an exemplar of how to behave with technology, not by any stretch of the imagination. I struggle with it myself, and I'm regularly pulled back, hoiked back sometimes, kicking and screaming by my wife, and it happens far more often than probably what it should. So the things that I've got to say over the next 2 weeks, some of them come very much from the struggles that I have myself. I am most definitely a technophile. I like technology. I make my living from technology. I make my living from looking at ways that technology can be used to solve problems. I'm also an information junkie. I love information. I like my news feeds where I get information about what's going on around the world, and I like diving down the rabbit holes. And if I'm left to myself, I like nothing better than to just catch up on news and read all sorts of different things. I get that constant stream of information, so I very much have to make sure that I control that and that I do that at appropriate times, and I don't let it become part of or interfere with other parts of my life. I know it's a challenge for me, and it's a continual one, and I'm sure it might be the same for many of you. My journey in this area of the impact of technology on ourselves and our families, for me, really started back in 2006, and I read a book called The World is Flat, which really looked at how internet technologies had connected everything up and made everything a whole lot smaller, as it were, flattening out the earth. And then a couple of years later, I came across another article in the Atlantic magazine called Is Google Making Us Stupid? And that really started to pique my interest, and I started to read a whole lot more then about the neuroscience around technology and what it was that was being observed at a neural level and the way that it was impacting the way we think. And that opened up some real areas of concern for me, not just for myself, but for our community as well. And God willing, we'll deal with more of that next week. Tonight, I want to pretty much cover 5 points, 5 questions, if you like, or areas of inquiry that we can have in our families and in our ecclesias that will help us to make decisions about what technologies we adopt, how quickly we adopt them, and to what extent they become then part of our community and our families. Hopefully that will give us some ways in which we can look at things perhaps a little bit differently. Who's heard of the term Luddite? Yep, a few people. Who would consider themselves a Luddite? No one. Okay. To a degree. All right, there you go. What is a Luddite? No smartphone. How would you define a Luddite? What do you think it is?
Like the Industrial Revolution and those were amazing.
Stop reading my notes. How would you define it today?
Someone that resists change.
Resist change, yep. That's often the way it's seen, isn't it? Someone who doesn't like technology, someone who resists the way that things might impact them. Right, and Matt was on the right track. He's quite on the ball. It comes from the Industrial Revolution in England in the late 1700s, early 1800s. Now, depending on who you read, there's some people who think there's a bit of fiction and legend around the name of the Luddites, but just for the sake of this, let's just go with what the legend says. So this man, Ned Ludd, supposedly started getting quite angry about what was happening in the Industrial Revolution, and that resulted in him smashing a couple of weaving machines. And then other people got angry as well, and they joined this movement, and so this Luddite movement grew, and masked gangs of men would then roam throughout industrial England and were smashing machines and causing all sorts of havoc. The news obviously spread, and then the law enforcement people tried to stop that, and so there's this quite amount of conflict. And so this Luddite movement has become synonymous then with people who kick against new technologies or changes in society. But there's actually an area of their way of thinking that's often overlooked. And if you have a look at their writings more closely, part of their key concern was not so much the technology itself, but the fact that this new technology and this new way of thinking had convinced particularly business owners to value machines above people. And in fact, in industrial England, you could be put to death for smashing a machine, but if you, by your negligence, created an industrial accident that killed 50 of your employees, then more often than not the way that was reported was, oh, that was human error. It wasn't the machine's fault, it was human error, and there was no penalty, nothing that came back on the business owners for that. So there was this real imbalance between the way that the machine was looked after and the way that people were looked after. And that was a lot of what sat behind the Luddites' concern. And that whole greed and selfishness of the industrial elite is something which has sustained the union movement for a couple of hundred years. But then if we want to step back from that and put ourselves in the position and say, where would we sit? Where would Christ want us to sit? We know well and truly, don't we, that Christ valued people, and God values people above any sort of machine. And that's the way he wants us to be as well. Matthew 6 and verse 26. Behold the fowls of the air, for they sow not, neither do they reap, nor gather into barns, yet your heavenly Father feedeth them. Are ye not much better than they? People were elevated. Again in Luke 11. If a son ask bread of any of you that is a father, will ye give him a stone? If he ask a fish, will he for a fish give him a serpent? Or if he ask an egg, will he offer him a scorpion? If ye then, being evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more shall your heavenly Father give the Holy Spirit to them that ask him? God and his Son elevate people above other things. And we could go many places in Scripture, couldn't we, which would reinforce that point, that people are important, relationships are important, and certainly they're elevated above the machine. So if we look at the Luddite movement in that context, then I don't know about you, but I'll probably have to sit back and think, well, I probably should be claiming myself to be a Luddite as well. I'm not resisting technology, but I should be making sure that I put people above technology. Okay, what is technology? How would you define technology? Any ideas?
Progress of thought that allows us to do things more efficiently.
Yep. Progress, doing things more efficiently, definitely. Any other thoughts?
Something to be used
Yeah, that's true. Can be used for good or evil. Here's how the author John Dyer, in his book From Garden to City, defines it. Technology is the means by which we transform the world as it is into the world that we desire. Now, if you think about any advancements in any technological area, that actually holds pretty true, doesn't it? That it's humans thinking, you know what, I want to be more comfortable. I want to change things a bit. I want something to be easier, more efficient for me. I want to do good. Sometimes there's people that want to do evil with it. Weapons might be one example of that. But they're trying to transform the world into something that they want it to be. And as you can see, can't you, that's pretty broad. There's a lot of things that can fall into that definition. Looking at the scripture, where would you say is the first mention of the human application of technology, if you take that definition? Tower of Babel? Anything earlier than that?
Garden of Eden.
What in the Garden of Eden?
Adam and Eve, when they took of their fruit, they want to be like the angels.
Yep, that's a good thought. Anything earlier than that? Sorry? Yeah,
Making of artifacts.
yep.
Physical instruments.
That's a bit later than the Garden of Eden, isn't it? But yep, exactly. Creation was God. So I said human application. Right.
Evolution, we classify evolution more in a way of looking in that way.
English coverings.
That's it. Yep. So Genesis 2. Oh no, sorry. No, we'll get to that one in a minute. Before then, even come across to Genesis 2. Genesis 2 and verse 15. And the Lord God took the man and put him into the Garden of Eden to dress it and to keep it. And that word dress has the idea behind it of shaping, right? Shaping the garden. So his job in the Garden of Eden was to shape it. So if Adam decided that he wanted to put a bridge over a stream here so that it was easier for him to get to the other side, he could do that. If he wanted to put a hedge round a certain grove or plant a particular grove in a particular place, he could do that. He was shaping his environment to something that he desired. That is the earliest mention of humans applying that idea of technological change. Ben picked up the next one, Genesis 3 and verse 7. They sewed fig leaves together, didn't they? So they were trying to cover themselves, and they took from their environment and they tried to shape that to make something that they desired. Interestingly, in verse 21 of chapter 3, it's God that gave the first technology upgrade when he gave them skins. The ark was technology, wasn't it? Tubal Cain, you mentioned making artefacts. There's weapons, there's farm implements, there's electricity, there's transport. The list goes on and on and on about things that have been created to help humans control or manage the environment in which they live. However, I guess when we come to our age, and I'm pretty certain that what people had in mind when this particular topic was decided was information and communication technologies, or the internet and the web. Often the terms internet and web are used interchangeably. I don't know whether people know the difference, but just briefly, the internet is the servers and the transport mechanisms, the cables and wires and things that transport the data around the world. The World Wide Web, that's where the www comes from, is the content, the pages that we see when we go to a website, or the content that we might download or transact over the internet. And that's evolved over time. So if we have a look at this diagram, I don't know how easy that's to see, but it basically, just forget about most of the stuff that's on there. At the big blue writing, you've got the PC era in the 90s. You've got the early web in around about the year 2000 or thereabouts, where you had dial-up modems and it was very slow and there wasn't a lot of content and it was difficult to manage. Then there was Web 2.0, where all of a sudden it wasn't just about you reading or downloading or consuming content. that people were starting to create content and put their own content out there. The like YouTube, Facebooks, MySpaces, all those sorts of things are exemplars, if you like, of that Web 2.0. Web 3.0, then it starts to, and you will have noticed this, that your algorithms start to play. Your Google algorithms, which start giving you information, which start sending you adverts, which curate your feeds and the information that you see. So it's starting to channel information to you. And that's probably the era that we're in at the moment. And then you've got Web 4.0, which is supposed to be when machine learning languages and artificial intelligence then starts to play a more significant role in the way that content and the web is transacted. There are those that think that's a lot further off than others, but you can see, can't you, the progression where it's quite static, unconnected to begin with, becomes connected, very static, consuming only, moves to not only consuming but creating, and then all these additional algorithms come into play that start to shape what we see, hear, transact, buy, so on and so forth. Here's another way of looking at it. I saw this on LinkedIn just the other day. That machines are learning, so talking about machine learning and learning from something, but the humans, well, they're just hooked on what the machines send them. So a lot of people, a lot of companies are really pushing into that area and are wanting to push on us a lot more information that they want us to have and to hook us into the types of transactions that they want. And the lesson that we can take, I think, from Genesis 11, as far as this is concerned, is, I think, a pertinent lesson. If we look at verse 4, they said, Go to, let us build a city and tower whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. It was all about them. The term for that is narcissism, and you may have heard that quite a bit. It's all about me. It's us. We want to promote our way of thinking. And a lot of the technologies that are available, particularly in the Web 2.0, was about giving people a voice, democratising the voice, letting everybody have a say. It was all about me and my opinion rather than listening to others. And that was because they had that common communication. So because they had that common communication, you see in verse 6, and the Lord said, Behold, the people is one, they have all one language, and this they begin to do. So what was seen with the Tower of Babel was known by the Elohim to be just the beginning. This is just the start. If they're starting to do this now, then what else could they do? And the answer is given to us there. It's nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do. And I think that really presents what the information communication technology world is at the moment. What do you imagine? What do you want to do? There's something for that. Something can grow. You can make something to do that. There's so much that it can do for you. It's only limited by imagination. And that's why, to me, the era that we're in at the moment is very much, I think, reflective of the attitudes and the atmosphere that is presented to us in the story of the Tower of Babel. A couple of quotes from one writer that I quite like, his way of thinking, Neil Postman. He wrote this in 1998. And this is where this comes from, is a number of conversations that I've had, particularly with older brethren in our community. So often we hear the older brethren saying words to the effect, I don't understand the technology. The conclusion being, I don't know how to help this. I don't know what to do here. This is all new to me. I can't understand it. I don't know how to help the younger generation. And I think what this first quote demonstrates to us is that that's not true. Because every age has had its challenges, and at the basis of all of those challenges is human nature. Modern technology in any era, whatever that technology was, is nothing more or less than the face of human nature, imagination, of human nature in that particular era. And as a community of Bible students, all of us are well versed in what human nature is, how it behaves, what it expects, what its foibles are. We should be really, really well placed as a community, families and ecclesias, to be able to shape the way that we handle technology. The second quote there, the human dilemma is as it has always been, and it is a delusion to believe that the technological changes of our era have rendered irrelevant the wisdom of the ages and the sages. We have in our community a wonderful resource in the senior brethren, the older brethren and sisters in our community, who have seen so many advents of things which challenge us and our community. So many of the ways in which these have been tackled in the past are the same ways that we need to tackle the modern era. And above everything else, we have the greatest source of wisdom in the Word of God that can help to guide and to shape the way that we approach these technologies. There's nothing that's facing us that we don't have some guidance for on how to handle. Another way that we can perhaps think about it, and I often find that if someone asks me how should we tackle this particular problem, is that the way that we would handle it in an offline sense is so often the way that we would handle it in an online sense as well. And so much of that comes back to the face-to-face relationships that we have with each other. If anything, the antidote to modern technology is the relationships that we have and we build. If we let those break down, then we're going to struggle. But if we can maintain those, the meeting together regularly, whether it's in families, whether it's in ecclesias, youth groups, whatever it might be, if we can maintain and grow that and really treasure that, then that will help us so much to answer the questions that we might be faced with. Anyone got any comments or questions that they want to point?
In addition to your last point,
Yep,
being a great conversationalist at heart,
I know that, yes.
the trend in the last few years that you cannot conduct a conversation with an elderly person without their being distracted by their mobile phones. Thank you for that.
Illustrated the point perfectly. Well done.
Right? The simple fact is that a face-to-face conversation,
Are you talking particularly with older people?
well, I'm an old person.
Yep.
When I try and talk to a younger person,
Right.
you know, they're doing this while they're talking to you. And you go, well, how much of your focus, of your concentration am I getting?
Yeah. And that's,
You're talking about their life and their problems.
and we'll particularly look at that last week. But just one thing to flip that around. Sorry, not last week, next week. I know which day I'm in. And I look at my parents and parents-in-law in this one, that my father and my father-in-law, we could be at the kitchen table having tea. If the phone dings or rings, then we've got to get it out. They always have to respond to it as well. And so it's not just an issue for the young as well. It's an issue for all of us.
The difference is because we come from an era where the phone didn't retain the information.
There might be something in that. But I mean, I can remember even when I had a corded phone at home and the phone rang, there was a rush, everyone to go and get it. It didn't matter what was going on. The phone rang, it had to be answered. It's not something new. Anything else before we move on? Okay, so for the first of our 5 principles, if we want to consider them as that, culture pays the price for technology. And culture is a word that gets thrown away a lot, and a lot of the time it's sort of talked about ethnically or nationally or something like that. But when I talk about culture, I'm just simply talking about a set of shared values that a group of people holds. The Bible would use the word fellowship to describe that. It's the things we hold together, things we share together. That's what we're talking about here. And the point here is that the introduction of a technology, any technology, is going to cause there to be a change to that. I can relate to this in my experiences in Fiji. When I first went to Fiji, it was very primitive, but a really lovely place to spend time with brothers and sisters. 30 years later, it's a lot different. I walk into that country and it's not a whole lot different to being here. It's changed along the way. But I think the thing we need to remember very much in our community is that we're not taking on this culture or that culture. It's the culture of Christ, the values of Christ that we need to have and to maintain and to keep close to us. You'll see in those little photos around the outside that each of those, there's a bunch of people together, but there's devices or some sort of thing that's keeping them apart. We often think about that in terms of smart devices, but you'll notice in some of those, there's books. Now, I know that just recently, Jude and I had a conversation which was, she's bemoaning the fact that the kids, as soon as they get in the car, they get their books out, so they don't talk to me anymore. They just want to read their books. And sometimes that can be a good thing, particularly on a long trip, but if it's all the time, well, you're together, but you're not. So I'm not trying to put the blame on modern technology for this. Older technologies can have the same impact. And over the years, as computers became a part of everyday life, often again I heard conversations, particularly in ecclesias, about we've got to hold on to the book. The printed word is the thing that we must hold on to. These modern technologies, they don't let you retain the information as well as what they used to. It's different, it's not the same. And it's very true that it is different, and next week we'll consider some of the differences about the way those two mediums affect our thinking. But the book itself is a technology. It was around about the 2nd century AD that the putting together leaves of paper or parchment and binding them together and walking around with it under your arm became a thing. It wasn't always that way. And all of a sudden you move from big, hefty, long 40-foot scrolls to smaller, more nimble carrying or containers of knowledge or information. And that changed the culture of Europe at that time. And one of the things that was noticed at that time is it became a conversation about the outsourcing of knowledge. All of a sudden, having it recorded, having it somewhere where you could transport it, I don't have to remember it anymore. And as books became smaller and smaller, and you could stick them in your pocket and printing and all of those sorts of things, then the way we thought about information and knowledge changed. So if we want to sort of talk about book versus computer, well, guess what? The book changed things as well. And interestingly, if you think about the civilization that God established in Israel, it wasn't a printed culture, was it? There were some people that would write. There was some recording. But it was very limited in Israel of the people who, A, had access to it or had the skill to do that. What God established in Israel was an oral culture. An oral culture relies on memory. You couldn't walk around with a book of proverbs or songs or parables or laws. It relied on you to have heard it and to remember it. Let's come across to Nehemiah 8. Nehemiah 8. And the first part of that chapter in Nehemiah 8 is talking about the reading of the law. We could look at verses 1 to 8, but to save time, I just want to focus in on particularly verses 7 and 8. So Nehemiah 8, verse 7. Also Jeshua and Bani and Shariah, Jamin, Akab, Shabbathiah, Hodijah, can't even read some of this myself, Maiah, Kilta, Azariah, Jozabad, Hannah, Pelaiah, and the Levites caused the people to understand the law, and the people stood in their place. So they read in the book of the law of God distinctly and gave the sense and caused them to understand the reading. And that was important, wasn't it? Because those people had to leave that place, go away to their place of living and to their communities, and they had to remember that. So the time was spent by Nehemiah and his people to make sure that they understood, and they caused them to understand. Memory was very, very important, and we'll talk more about that next week. And just so, again, getting back to the arguments perhaps between book versus computer, here's a quote from, it's by Plato talking about Socrates. So this is back in the time, Socrates was an orator. Plato had come across this newfangled technology called writing and the alphabet, and he thought that was pretty cool. And in their arguments, then Socrates is said to have made this argument that writing will create forgetfulness in the learners' souls because they will not use their memories. He saw that move from memory to writing as being something which was going to be degrading to the person rather than enhancing it. Going down a little bit further, they will be hearers of many things and will have learned nothing. They will appear to be omniscient and will generally know nothing. They will be tiresome company, having the show of wisdom without the reality. So there you go. Back in, was it 400 BC, 200 BC, whenever it was. I can't even remember when he 400. Yep, okay, 400 BC. That's right. So all the way back in 400 BC, this same argument between an old technology and a new technology was playing out. It's not new, these conversations that we're having. So the point that we can take from that, if we think about that from ourselves, from our families and for our ecclesias, that when a new technology is introduced, no matter what it is, then that group is changed. So the question that we can take from that principle then is not just to ask what the technology will do, but perhaps to consider what it might undo. What will it take away? Now, obviously, modern technologies with their search capabilities and all those things have made the finding of information very easy, simple, efficient, wonderful. But perhaps it's further degraded our memories. And let's remember, after all, that the point that God wants us all to come to is to have his word written on the fleshy tables of our heart. Even pulling out our Bible and saying, oh look, I think I know where it is, and looking up a particular page and a column and an upper or lower part of the page, that's just a particular search technique that we've taught ourselves because I can't quite remember the exact words. That degraded our memories, or perhaps we didn't even have that. And the new search technologies are taking that to further extent. So it's changing. It changes the way that we approach information. And perhaps, maybe not in all cases, but perhaps we're thinking less about learning and memorising and making it part of the way we think, and more about what do I need to know to be able to find this again in the future. Something for us to think about. Second thing to consider. The benefits of technology are never distributed evenly. Every time there's a new technology that comes in, there's going to be people that win from that and people that maybe not lose but don't benefit from that so much. And in those pictures there, you've got a school class that doesn't have technology, another one that's full of technology. And more that I read about technology in schools and education, there's this disparity of what's available. But is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, that's another question. And these things, again, have happened right throughout history. Can you imagine the blacksmith extolling the virtues of the car, thinking that he was going to be able to work side by side with this newfangled transportation device? Put him out of business, along with the buggy maker and the whip makers. And often it can be the rich and the poor that benefit or are disadvantaged accordingly. So in our ecclesial and family environments, we've got to make sure that we consider that, and that we try to make sure that in the application of it, in the adoption of any technology, that we're making sure that everyone's brought along, that everyone's included. I had an example in a youth group in another ecclesia that I was at a few years ago, and they decided in their youth group that everything was going to be announced through Facebook. And I think, 97% of people are on Facebook, that's a good thing. But there were some families in that ecclesia that said, we don't want our kids to go near Facebook. We want to stay away from that. That's not part of what we want in our family. The attitude of the youth group leaders was, oh, well, you're just not going to find out about it. You'll have to ring someone and find out what's going on. They weren't prepared to make sure that everybody was included. Now, in my view, I don't think that's something that's acceptable. That all of us are responsible, and particularly leaders, whether it's youth leaders, whether it's ecclesial leaders, whether it's family leaders, we have a responsibility to make sure that if we're going to use a particular technology in our community, that everyone's brought along for the ride and that everybody is included. Take extra care. And it's our responsibility to take that extra care to make sure that people aren't disadvantaged. To the arranging brethren, I would say this. I think there's a lot of work to be done in our ecclesial community to support families. Strong families, of course, we know equal strong ecclesias. I remember an example from many years ago where a brother told me that he had someone turn up on his doorstep, a brother and someone he didn't know, and the comment from the brother was, I've sold your TV, they're here to pick it up, because they'd come in from outside and they had this TV and they didn't know any difference, and the first thing that they knew it wasn't a good thing was when a brother turned up and had it sold. Maybe that's not the best way to go about things, well-intentioned though that might have been. But I think there needs to be regular conversations between brethren and brethren, between sisters and sisters, perhaps between brethren and sisters, to make sure that our families are supported and can work through these issues together, that we support each other. If one family thinks, I'm a bit concerned about that, that others will support them and their family in those things, that we won't just show a DVD to any kid that comes around because we don't know necessarily whether the children of that family is something that their parents want them to have. We find too that the school is pushing more technology on our children as well, aren't they? Well, we need to think about that. How's that going to play out in our families? Is that the right thing? Is it necessary? Do we need to perhaps push back on schools and sort of say, you know what, I'm just not comfortable with that? Young families can perhaps be helped to understand how to maintain those core values in their families, and remember that everybody is susceptible. None of us is on a higher plane than anyone else. We're all capable of using things well and not using them well, and we all need each other's help, so we're all on the same level and we need to work together on that. All right, the next one. Every technology has an embedded philosophy. What I mean by that is that every time somebody introduces a technology, there's a particular vision that they have in mind for the way that's to be used, what they want out of it. Now, you might look at it and say, well, I can adapt it and use it for that or for something else, but that's not the way that that person designed it. That's not what they want it to do. It's not what they're going to develop any further iterations of that technology to do to help and support you. They have a particular thing that they want to get out of it, whether it's marketing, whether it's trying to gather information from you so that they can sell that to someone else. It doesn't matter what it is, it predisposes to a particular way of thinking. Now, we talked about oral cultures. Well, oral culture values memory, doesn't it? So songs, proverbs, parables, those sorts of things become important. In a print culture, it perhaps lends itself towards the logical organisation and analysis of information. You're not constrained by much. You can lay out these beautiful logical analyses of a particular topic. In a digital culture, then it's data which is valuable, information, immediacy, but perhaps less so wisdom and knowledge. The whole point of these particular technologies is so they can draw something out of us, usually in the form of money of some kind. The electronic communication, blogs, forums, texts, instant messages, they're short, sharp, light on emotion, light on empathy. They're not built for those purposes. That's not the reason that they were created. So if we're going to introduce those technologies into our families, into communities, then we need to try and make sure that it's not drawing us down those paths. Social media has this bias towards you promoting your voice, and that can draw out narcissism in us, something for us to be quite careful about. Smartphone. Well, I can pull it out of my pocket at any time. I can look up whatever I want at any time, whether it's in the readings, whether it's at the tea table, when I'm with friends, when I'm in a conversation with someone. It doesn't matter what it is, it's immediate. And again, we'll look at some of these statistics next week, but it's phenomenal the number of interruptions that people are getting with smart devices. Google has a particular function on its phones where it tells you how many times you've pulled your phone out and unlocked it a day and how many notifications you've had of this and that. And I pull my phone out from time to time and look at that, and I'm sort of stunned by the number of interruptions that I've had. Some of those are self-inflicted, some of those are coming from other people, but we need to understand that. That's what it does to us. It pulls us toward those things. Okay, the next concept is partly something that we've been talking about already, but when you introduce a technology, you don't just have what you had before plus the technology. Best analogy of that is a cake mix, isn't it? That you put all the ingredients in, you mix it together, you no longer have the eggs, milk, flour, you have a cake mix. It's different, and it's very difficult to undo that. You can't separate those things easily. And that's the point which is sort of being made in this, is that when we look at a particular technology, when we introduce it, we need to think about what we've got when we're finished. If we look at the technologies that we have, I mean, we're using PowerPoint. That's relatively new. There's other things that other technologies that we have in our ecclesias. They've often come along bit by bit. We've added something to it. Oh, now it can do this. Oh, now it can do something extra. Oh, now we've got this. And before you know it, where we started from is very different from where we are in the present. And it does us well to think and to consider about the consequences of any technological change. Inevitably, it will be quite vast. It's going to affect many, many different parts of our community. Not only that, but it's often unpredictable. You can't necessarily know what it's going to be in the future. So we need to think about what that is. We're never going to get it right all the time. We might introduce something thinking, oh, look, this is pretty benign, but you know what? In 5 years' time, we think, oh, boy, look what we've done. And the reversal of that is really, really difficult. And can you imagine what would happen if you took PowerPoint out of our community? We'd be lost, wouldn't we? I mean, how are we going to give talks? Gee, without PowerPoint, it'd be a shocker. And all the animations that we can do with it, all the exciting, we hold people's attention. How are we going to be able to hold people's attention? It would be very difficult to unwind some of these things. Technologists, I think you could say by definition, are risk takers. They want to push things. They want new things out there. They want to see how far you can push this particular boundary. But not only do they do that, they don't really take a lot of thought for what the impact is on other aspects of culture. Most of them want to, as I said, exploit those technologies for some sort of financial gain in many cases, or to gain something. They want to push things to the fullest and don't really think about what's gone when they're finished. And as families and ecclesias, we really need to take stock of that, and we need to think quite carefully about what might be gone in 5 years' time if we adopt this particular technology. Now, I know that this talk tonight is being streamed, and I think that the streaming of our talks has been a great thing for people who are sick, people who are struggling perhaps, but I also know of people who use it so that they don't have to go to an ecclesia anywhere. They can log on to any ecclesial meeting virtually anywhere in the world at any given time. And there's people that I knew when I was young that no longer go to a meeting even though they might log into something. Now, do you stop the one because of the other? No, not necessarily. But we do have to think about how they're being used, what the impact of that is, and be really, really conscious of perhaps there's people that might need help and are using something, a particular technology, to get around something. What about the new fangled devices, the Google Home and Alexa and some of these other devices that are turning our homes into smart homes? Great things that can come out of that. Oh, play me this piece of music. Find out this fact for me. Rather than my kid having to sit on a computer and do his research homework, he can just speak to the device and he can get the answers for his research assignment at school. It's safer because I don't have him maybe clicking on something and ending up somewhere else. But what would that turn my family into? What would my family be in 5 years' time? Is that a good thing? Well, personally, as I said, I'm a technophile. I love the thought of these things. What can it do? How can I do this? Jude, you can look up a recipe. You can have it, read it out to you. Fantastic. But not necessarily something that is going to benefit my home in the future. Another thing that I've noticed, and again, I'm not commenting on whether this is good or bad, but I think I was at the recent end-of-year studies, I noticed, or maybe they do it at Suburban as well, I don't know, but when people didn't have hymn books anymore, or the hymns were projected up on the screen. Well, that's great, less books to carry. PowerPoint presentations, I can put all my quotes up, don't have to turn anything up, fantastic. Very easy, and I can pound huge amounts of information at people. But again, is that a good thing? Is that where we want our community to be? I remember 15 years ago going to a Baptist church, and that was exactly what they were doing. Everything projected, didn't have to take anything. There was nobody in that hall that had a book of any kind that was looking anything up or engaging in that way. Is that a bad thing? I don't know. But it's something that we need to think about. So the consequences of introducing a technology, as I said, can be unpredictable. We just need to think about what that is and understand that by adding it, we are changing our community accordingly. The last item, last of the 5, that any technology eventually just becomes part of the background. It just blends into the background and becomes normal. How many of us think about turning on the lights and the lights go on? Where does that electricity come from? We don't. That was a technology back in the 1900s, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, that companies would have vice president of electricity on their board in their senior management teams because it was something that they needed and it was a resource that was unstable and unpredictable and they wanted somebody managing that. Nobody has that now. Unless you're in South Australia and the whole state goes out, then you've got to think about that. But they're odd events, aren't they? That electricity is just seen as normal, yet that was a brand new technology at one point in time. Younger generation have never known an era without an ATM. Never known an era or known a place that doesn't have McDonald's. Yet all of those things came in at a particular point in time and was a newfangled technology and was great or the end of the world, depending on where you come from it. So our enthusiasm for technology can be something that allows that technology just to become part of the way that we are. And it's probably, again, something that's important for us to think about so that we don't just let it become that. We work out which parts of technology we actually do need to hold at arm's length, both in our families and our ecclesias, and ones which we can accept. Now, there's nothing particularly malignant about electricity. But there might be a technology that we want to introduce that actually might bear some thinking about. Just understand that it will become part of the background, part of our way of handling things if we don't think about it. That's the way the technologists want it. Every time that something's introduced, they don't want you to think about using it, they just want you to use it. And that can go for anything. This quote found from Douglas Adams, and yes, he's of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy fame. Come up with a set of rules to describe our reactions to technology. First of all, anything in the world that was in the world when you were born, well, that's just ordinary. That's normal, that's expected. That's just part of the way the world works. Anything that's invented between the ages of 15 and 35, it's new, it's exciting, it's revolutionary, it's the coolest thing on earth. And yep, you can probably get a career in it at some point in time. Think mobile app development, whatever. And the third group, anything invented after you're 35, all of a sudden becomes against the natural order of things. It's to be held off. It's not to be something that's accepted. It's going to change things too badly. It's going to change my environment. I don't like it. Different reactions. And that can be the case with all of us. And look, it's not age-based. It can be different people at different ages think about things in all of those areas. But what it demonstrates is the different ways that we can approach things that are happening around us and our reactions to it. I would suggest that, again, we need to be cautious. Okay, so just rounding things off. Here's a quote again from Neil Postman. So, in the past we experienced technological change in a manner of sleepwalkers. Our unspoken slogan, technology über alles. This is technology above all. You might even put in there technology max free, from technology makes free. And we've been willing to shape our lives to fit the requirements of technology. This is a form of stupidity, especially in an age of vast technological change. We need to proceed with our eyes wide open so that we may use technology rather than being used by it. And I think that's probably the key message that I wanted to get across tonight. I'm not saying don't use technology. As I said, I like technology. Maybe a little too much. But we do need to make sure that we are using it for a task, that we're using it to do a job, and that we're not just using it for the sake of using it. Our final slide for tonight, and again this is from Postman, and I like this. I think it's a great way to think about technology. Just remember, it's not of God. God didn't create these things. Technology hasn't been created to smooth our way to the kingdom. It's not there for that reason. It's a product of human creativity. Humans have built it. Humans have made it to shape their world to the way they desire, and we're often just taken along for the ride. So what we'll get into next week is a bit more of that last bit of that quote, of what it does for us, not just for us, but what it does to us. And we'll look at that in a little bit more detail. And I think we all know that we may as well try and hold back the tide as to try and hold back technological change. It's going to happen. We're going to be a part of it. We're going to want to adopt it. There's going to be value in us adopting it. And it can help us in many, many ways, keeping us connected together, helping to connect with people that might need help, all sorts of great things that it can do for us. But we do need to make sure that we maintain a level of control over it. So the message that I want us to take away from tonight is to think carefully about what it is that we're using the technology for. Remember that it has a way of behaving, it has an expectation associated with it, and we need to make sure that in using it, that expectation is something that is something which is going to help us and support us in our fellowship together. So next week, God willing, as I said, I want to look more closely at its impact of these technologies on our physical brain. So we're talking about physiological. So there's definitely a moral aspect to it, and you know, talking to Brother Ben the other night, very much a conscience aspect to it, and we'll talk about that. But there's also a physiological aspect to it, which perhaps we don't think about. And some of that may surprise you a bit. And I think if we can understand both of those levels, then it will help us in our own way of thinking to make good choices for ourselves and for our families and for our ecclesia. Thank you.